I could feel the heat rising in my chest as I arranged the last of the decorations in the grand hall of our home. Every balloon, every ribbon, every candle was in place, just as I had imagined. The party tonight wasn't just any gathering, it was my party, but not in the way anyone expected. My husband, Greg, thought he was taking his mistress, Vanessa, out for a glamorous evening. Little did he know, I had orchestrated every detail. The doorbell rang, and my stomach twisted with anticipation. I took a deep breath, letting the faint scent of vanilla and roses settle over me. When the chauffeur opened the door for them, Vanessa's heels clicked against the marble, loud and confident. She smiled at me like I was just a polite host, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. Greg's hand found mine, and he squeezed it. He didn't know I was fully aware of everything, yet he felt the shift, even if he couldn't place it. I guided them into the room, the soft music masking the quiet, calculated tension. Vanessa leaned in, whispering something I couldn't hear over the pounding of my heart. I smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of my lips that didn't reach my eyes. Tonight was about revelations, and I had saved the best one for last. The hors d'oeuvres were laid out, the champagne chilled, and the lights dimmed just enough to make everyone feel glamorous and exposed at the same time. I could already see the cracks forming in Greg's carefully constructed arrogance. The party was my idea, my masterpiece, and he would never forget it. Greg was still basking in his sense of control, oblivious to the way I had designed every moment to unmask him. Vanessa twirled a glass of champagne in her hand, laughing at jokes I hadn't made, completely unaware she was stepping into my trap. I let them enjoy it, letting the calm, almost casual demeanor cloak the storm I had brewing inside me. The guests arrived one by one, friends, colleagues, neighbors, people who admired me, people who Greg assumed would be dazzled by his charm. I watched them closely, letting their casual glances, their polite smiles build the tension I wanted. Each arrival was a note in a symphony of suspense. Then I called for everyone's attention, a soft but commanding voice over the gentle hum of conversation. Greg's smile faltered slightly. Vanessa's head tilted, curious. I made it seem like a toast, a celebration of... Well, that was for me to reveal later. I raised my glass and spoke, slow and deliberate. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. And I especially want to acknowledge someone who has taught me a lot about trust and about consequences. A hush fell over the room. Greg's hand went slack in mine. Vanessa's grin froze, and I could hear the tiniest crack of panic in her confident facade. I didn't rush. I let the silence linger, stretching it just enough for the weight to settle in their chests. I had given them the illusion of control, but the first thread of my surprise had already begun to unravel their world. The moment had arrived. I signaled subtly, and the lights dimmed further, focusing on a large screen I had installed just for tonight. Greg's eyes narrowed as the first images flickered to life, photos of him and Vanessa, taken without their knowledge over the past months. Candids of stolen smiles, secret texts, and quiet dinners I'd discovered piece by piece. The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that vibrated through my chest. Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth, her confidence crumbling. Greg's face went pale, a sheen of sweat forming at his temples. I stepped closer, my heels clicking softly against the floor, the sound sharp in the stunned silence. I thought tonight could be a celebration, I said evenly, my voice calm, but with an edge that made them shiver. Instead, it's a reminder that truth has a way of showing itself, no matter how well you hide. I watched them squirm under the gaze of everyone present, the colleagues, the friends, the neighbors, people who respected me and whose opinions Greg had always dismissed. Vanessa's arrogance melted into panic. Greg opened his mouth to speak, but the weight of exposure left him speechless. I let it linger, letting every second stretch and pull at the tension like a live wire. This was the first real strike, the one that shattered the illusion of power they had both carried so carelessly. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I let the evidence speak for me, and for every quiet hour I had spent plotting this night, by the time the screen went dark, the damage was done. The room's hum had turned into whispers, and Greg realized for the first time that the party wasn't about fun or glamour. It was about him facing the consequences he had tried so desperately to avoid. The whispers didn't stop. They swirled around Greg like a storm he couldn't escape. I sipped my champagne calmly, letting the murmurs wash over me, savoring the tiny spark of fear in his eyes. Vanessa tried to laugh it off, but it came out strained, hollow. I could see her mind racing, trying to find an escape, but the room had already closed in on her. I moved through the crowd with ease, exchanging smiles and polite nods, letting my presence reinforce the truth of the moment. I was in control. Greg followed me with a panicked gaze, his hand gripping mine too tightly. I loosened my fingers just enough to let him feel it, a reminder that I held the upper hand. Then I took him aside, my voice low and deliberate. "You thought this was about hiding, about pretending," I said. "But tonight is about showing everyone who you really are and who I am." The sting in my words made him flinch, though he tried to mask it. I watched as the guests, people who had silently judged and observed for months, began to approach me with subtle nods of respect. Quiet congratulations whispered just loud enough for Greg to hear. Each one was a quiet dagger in his pride. I felt a thrill, a rush of vindication, but it was tempered by the calm satisfaction of knowing I had orchestrated it perfectly. By the end of the evening, Vanessa slipped out unnoticed, humiliated and defeated, and Greg followed her with a look that begged for forgiveness I would not grant. I stayed behind, raising my glass to the friends who remained, the ones who had witnessed the truth unfold. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt untouchable. After Vanessa left, the room felt charged, electric. I could feel the eyes of the remaining guests on me, not just observing, but acknowledging me, my strength, my control. Greg lingered near the edge of the crowd, his confidence stripped bare. I didn't rush him. I let him stew, letting the weight of what had happened settle fully before I approached. I found him standing near the grand piano, fingers drumming nervously against the polished surface. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by a mix of shame and disbelief. I didn't know you knew," he muttered, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound calm. "I knew everything," I said simply, stepping closer. "Every text, every lie, every excuse you thought would protect you. I saw it all, and tonight everyone else did too." My words were steady, each one a blade of quiet authority. Greg's shoulders slumped, the arrogance he wore like armor completely dismantled. I made a mistake," he whispered, almost pleading. I shook my head, letting the faint scent of vanilla and my perfume mix in the air between us. "This wasn't about mistakes," I said. "This was about respect, about boundaries, about showing you that your choices have consequences." I could see him searching for a way to argue, to charm, to shift blame, but there was no space left for lies. The truth had already taken its full form, and it was undeniable. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I simply took his hand, not with forgiveness, but with authority, guiding him to stand beside me as I addressed the remaining guests. Sometimes the hardest lessons are learned not in private, but in the light of everyone who knows your truths, I said, my voice calm, measured, and unwavering. The respect in the room shifted fully to me, and Greg's eyes, once arrogant, now reflected fear, regret, and the stark realization that he had lost the upper hand entirely. Later, after the guests had left, I walked through the empty hall, the faint echoes of whispers still in my ears. The smell of champagne, candles, and subtle hints of rose lingered. A memory of the night I took control and held it without compromise. I could still hear Greg in the study, sitting in silence, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. I let him sit there. This was his reckoning, and I would watch it unfold quietly, fully satisfied. For the first time in years, I felt free, strong, unshakable, and I knew that no one, not Vanessa, not Greg, not anyone, would ever forget the night I orchestrated their exposure, their humiliation, and my triumph. The next morning, our house was quiet, almost reverent, the remnants of the party scattered like faint memories. Crumpled napkins, half-empty glasses, the subtle scent of roses still clinging to the air. I wandered through the rooms slowly, letting my fingers brush along the furniture, absorbing the silence. It was a silence I had earned, a quiet that belonged to me. Greg didn't approach me. He didn't speak. He lingered in the study, the faint light of dawn illuminating the lines of worry on his face. I could hear the soft shuffle of papers, the almost inaudible mutter of regret. He was reeling, still trapped in the aftermath, and I let him feel it fully. Every decision, every betrayal had finally caught up with him. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling the kitchen, and I let myself smile. Not a cruel smile, but a quiet one, full of satisfaction and clarity. For months, I had held my emotions in check, planning, observing, calculating. Tonight, the payoff wasn't just revenge, it was liberation. I was no longer invisible in my own life. I was seen and I was respected. When Greg finally stepped into the kitchen, the weight in his shoulders was unmistakable. His eyes avoided mine, searching for words that wouldn't come. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting him wait, letting him understand that control had shifted completely. "I understand why you did it," he finally said, his voice low, careful. I can't fix it, can I?" "You can't undo the truth," I replied simply. "But you can learn from it. And maybe one day you'll respect the person I've always been." There was no bitterness in my tone, only firmness, clarity, and an unshakable sense of self. The shift was complete. I had turned betrayal into empowerment, humiliation into revelation, and in doing so, I had reclaimed everything I had lost to secrecy and deceit. Greg would never forget this night, this lesson, or me. And I had finally stepped fully into my own light. The weeks that followed were quiet, but they were alive with a new energy that I had never allowed myself before. Greg stayed distant, lingering in the shadow of the consequences I had laid bare. I didn't chase him, didn't beg for apologies or explanations. I let him sit in the quiet tension he had created. Instead, I focused on myself, on the life I had neglected while his betrayals and lies consumed my attention. I started small, morning runs through the leafy streets of our neighborhood, feeling the cool autumn air against my skin, the sharp scent of fallen leaves filling my lungs. I took to the kitchen with abandon, experimenting with flavors, textures, and scents, letting the act of creation be a meditation, a reclaiming of joy that had nothing to do with him. Friends started visiting more often, drawn not by pity or gossip, but by the radiance of someone who had faced the storm and emerged whole. I laughed louder, spoke more freely, and even caught the eye of colleagues in ways that reminded me of my worst outside of a marriage that had tried to define me. Greg watched all of this quietly. He was present physically, but emotionally absent, caught in the realization that the woman he had underestimated was now untouchable. I noticed the subtle shifts in him, the way he paused before speaking, the careful weight of his words, the new respect in his eyes that hadn't been there before. It wasn't the vindictive satisfaction I craved, because that would have been hollow. It was the quiet, undeniable truth that I was no longer the person who would tolerate betrayal in silence. One evening, I hosted a dinner for close friends, an intimate gathering filled with warmth, laughter, and the kind of joy that radiates from someone who has reclaimed their life. Greg sat across from me, awkward, tense, aware that he no longer held the center of my world. As I moved through the room, serving dishes I had prepared with care, I realized the most powerful thing about this victory. It wasn't the exposure, the humiliation, or the public spectacle. It was the quiet, unshakable confidence I carried in every step, every gesture, every word. I caught Greg's eye across the table and held it for a long moment, not with malice, but with a calm authority that made him pause, rethink, and acknowledge the woman he had wronged. Vanessa was gone, a ghost of a threat, and I was surrounded by people who loved me, not because of who I was married to, but because of who I had always been. For the first time in years, I felt untethered from his deceit, from his lies, and from the toxic weight he had carried into my life. That night, as the last guest left and I closed the door behind them, I stood in the middle of the living room, letting the silence wash over me. The faint scent of my cooking lingered. The lights cast a soft glow over the furniture, and for the first time, I truly felt the depth of my own power. This wasn't just survival. This was triumph. This was claiming everything that had been denied to me, quietly, gracefully, irreversibly. I poured myself a glass of wine, and I smiled, knowing that the life I had taken back wasn't just my victory over Greg or Vanessa. It was my reclamation of myself, my joy, and my unshakable worth. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, painting the living room in gold and amber. I stood there, barefoot on the hardwood, the air carrying the faint smell of coffee and autumn leaves from the open window. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of anyone else's choices on my shoulders. I had reclaimed my life in a way that was quiet, undeniable, and permanent. Greg was gone from the room. I had let him retreat, knowing that any confrontation now would serve only my own peace. I didn't need his acknowledgement or his presence anymore. He had learned painfully that control was not his to hold, and that trust, once broken, could only be rebuilt on my terms. Vanessa was gone too. Her threat evaporated, a fading memory of arrogance and betrayal. The storm had passed, leaving me in the calm after, whole and unshakable. I walked through the house, touching the furniture, the walls, everything I had chosen, curated and claimed as my own. Each item felt like a symbol of my independence. The kitchen where I experimented freely, the living room where I entertained friends who truly saw me, the garden where I could breathe without fear or expectation. Every corner held the quiet satisfaction of a life rebuilt from the ground up. Later, I met my closest friends for brunch at a sunlit cafe downtown. Their laughter, warm and unrestrained, reminded me that joy wasn't fleeting. It was a choice, a reclamation, a statement. I realized that my strength wasn't in public spectacle or revenge. It was in my ability to live fully, unapologetically, and without compromise. Every glance, every compliment, every shared smile reinforced the truth I had always known, but had allowed him to overshadow. I was enough, I was powerful, and I was free. When I returned home, I paused in the doorway, listening to the quiet hum of the house. The faint scent of roses and vanilla lingered, a memory of the night everything changed. I smiled, not because of what I had done to him, but because of what I had done for myself. I poured a glass of wine, letting it catch the sunlight, and raised it to the empty room, to the life I had claimed, to the woman I had become. I had orchestrated a night that exposed deceit, and I had walked through the aftermath with grace and unshakable strength. But the true victory wasn't in humiliation, it was in my rebirth. I had proven to myself and to the world that no betrayal, no lie, no hidden affair could diminish my power, my worth, or my joy. And as I sipped my wine, I knew one simple, unshakable truth. I had not just survived, I had won.